It started with a knock on my door and a letter from the HOA that changed everything. They claimed my jetty, the one I spent months planning and building, was illegal. No warning, no conversation, just a notice saying it had to be removed immediately, or else. I was stunned. I'd followed every rule, every regulation. In fact, I had Supreme Court approval for the construction, but the HOA didn't seem to care. They were convinced I'd broken some mysterious rule buried deep in their handbook. At first, I thought it had to be a mistake, maybe a mix-up with someone else's property. But the more I asked questions, the clearer it became. This wasn't about rules. This was about power. The HOA president, let's just say, wasn't exactly a fan of mine. And once I started pushing back, things got even messier. Threats of fines, community gossip, and even anonymous complaints started pouring in. I knew I had to stand up for myself, not just for the jetty, but because I wasn't going to let a group of entitled people twist the truth and bulldoze over my rights. So I did the only thing I could. I gathered every piece of evidence, dusted off my legal file, and pulled out the trump card they never saw coming. But when I finally showed them the Supreme Court's stamp of approval, they didn't back down. In fact, the HOA doubled down, claiming their community bylaws overruled everything, even a legal document from the highest court in the country. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a jetty. This was personal, and it was turning into something much bigger than a property dispute. The jetty itself wasn't anything wild, just a modest extension from my backyard into the lake, mostly for fishing and relaxing. I'd gone through every permit, spent months in meetings, and even waited over a year for final approval. The Supreme Court's involvement wasn't because it was extravagant, but because the lake was part of a larger environmental zone, and my case had gotten wrapped into a broader legal issue years ago. I won that fight fair and square. But the HOA, they never liked that I went over their heads. Some of them had lived in the neighborhood for decades and thought they ran the place. And honestly, I think they hated the idea of one of us regular homeowners standing up to them and winning. Now, every time I walked outside, I felt eyes on me. Whispered conversations stopped when I came near. It felt like a quiet war had started, and my jetty was ground zero. But the worst part was still coming, and I had no idea just how far they were willing to go. They didn't back down. In fact, the HOA doubled down, claiming their community bylaws overruled everything, even a legal document from the highest court in the country. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a jetty. This was personal, and it was turning into something much bigger than a property dispute. The jetty itself wasn't anything wild, just a modest extension from my backyard into the lake, mostly for fishing and relaxing. I'd gone through every permit, spent months in meetings, and even waited over a year for final approval. The Supreme Court's involvement wasn't because it was extravagant, but because the lake was part of a larger environmental zone, and my case had gotten wrapped into a broader legal issue years ago. I won that fight fair and square. But the HOA, they never liked that I went over their heads. Some of them had lived in the neighborhood for decades and thought they ran the place. And honestly, I think they hated the idea of one of us regular homeowners standing up to them and winning. Now, every time I walked outside, I felt eyes on me. Whispered conversations stopped when I came near. It felt like a quiet war had started, and my jetty was ground zero. But the worst part was still coming, and I had no idea just how far they were willing to go. Things really started spiraling when I received a notice about a mandatory compliance meeting with the HOA board. No details, just a date, time, and a vague warning that my unauthorized structure was under review. I knew what it was about. They were setting me up. I showed up with a folder full of documents, Supreme Court approval, environmental clearances, even signed letters from local authorities. But it didn't matter. The room was ice cold the second I walked in, and the vibe was hostile. The board didn't even look at my papers. They just repeated the same line. This jetty violates community standards. I wasn't the only one watching this unfold. My neighbor Jason quietly pulled me aside afterward. Turns out he had his own run-in with the HOA a year ago over repainting his garage. Same pattern, false claims, ignored paperwork, and lots of intimidation. It wasn't just about the jetty. There was a history here. A small group of board members had been pushing out homeowners they didn't like under the guise of maintaining standards. Even more strange, someone had started photographing my property. I caught a person crouched behind the fence one morning, camera in hand, claiming they were documenting rule violations. I reported it, no response. That's when I started recording everything, because I had a feeling this wasn't going to end with just a few letters and fines. The tension hit a boiling point about 2 weeks later. I came home from work to find a bright orange notice nailed to the jetty post. Final warning. Structure to be removed within 72 hours or subject to HOA action. My stomach dropped. No court order, no city involvement, just a threat straight from the HOA, like they were above the law. I took photos, filed another report with the local council, and tried to stay calm. But inside, I was furious. They were daring me to react, hoping I'd back down. The next night, I noticed tire tracks near the side gate, deep ones, fresh. I checked my security camera footage. At 2:47 a.m., a pickup truck with no plates stopped near the edge of my yard. 2 people got out, scoped around with flashlights, and left. I couldn't make out their faces, but the timing was too perfect to be random. Someone was watching, planning something. Meanwhile, word spread around the neighborhood. Some folks stopped waving when they saw me. A few quietly messaged to say they supported me, but were afraid to speak out. One even told me their HOA fees were quietly increased after they refused to vote with the board. It was all closing in. I'd followed every law, every rule, but they didn't care. And with the deadline ticking down, I knew something big was coming. I just didn't know how far they'd go to stop me. Just when I thought things couldn't get worse, I got a call from the county office, and that's when everything flipped. They told me a new complaint had been filed against me, not just for the jetty, but for unauthorized land development and potential environmental disruption. These weren't just HOA issues anymore. Someone had escalated it to a government level, and it didn't take much digging to figure out where it came from. One of the board members, turns out, had a cousin who worked in the county zoning office. Suddenly, the fight wasn't just local, it was political. I asked for the file. What I saw blew my mind. The complaint included fake aerial images, manipulated documents, and claims that I had extended the jetty into a protected area, completely false. They even claimed I'd removed native plants and disrupted wildlife, which couldn't have been more wrong. The jetty had been designed asterisk around asterisk all that. I had video, emails, everything. But now I was up against more than just the HOA. At this point, I couldn't sleep. My cameras were on 24/7s. I caught the same pickup trucks circling again, twice in 1 week. My mailbox was tampered with, and someone started leaving HOA newsletters on my porch with certain sections underlined. It wasn't just a property dispute anymore. This was a setup, and I was being pushed towards something bigger, something they didn't think I'd be able to fight back against. The 72-hour deadline came and went, but I didn't take the jetty down. Instead, I filed an emergency injunction with the help of a local attorney who'd been quietly watching everything unfold. She'd dealt with the HOA before and knew their game. The moment the paperwork hit, everything paused. Suddenly, the board went quiet. No more notices, no more threats. It felt like the calm before a storm. Then came the hearing. I walked into the county building with every document, photo, and video I had. My lawyer laid it all out: Supreme Court approval, environmental clearance, evidence of harassment, and even a security footage of the truck. The board tried to argue community character, but the judge shut it down fast. The final blow came when my lawyer revealed that the manipulated complaint had been traced back to a personal email linked to the HOA president's own address. It was over. The judge ruled in my favor. Not only was the jetty legal, but the HOA was ordered to cease all further action against me and issue a written apology. But just when I thought it was done, the twist came. A reporter covering the case discovered that several homeowners in our neighborhood had faced similar intimidation tactics. What started as a personal fight suddenly turned into a class action lawsuit against the HOA board. And this time, I wasn't fighting alone.